Hi, everyone. I think this is 2 o'clock by my time here, and I hope I can be heard loud and clear. So it's just to welcome all of us here to the NITheCS routine webinar. And in today's session, we have amongst us a student, a postgraduate student, who would be sharing with us what he's currently researching on. And his name is Gift Sontaga Foran. Foran will be taking us through um, the research on synergizing emotional intelligence with African cultural context for AI-driven mental health support. And Gifts is being supervised or mentored by a whole bunch of, mentoring team, among which is Absalom Izugu, who is myself, and I'm a lecturer at the Northwest University. And we also have, among the research team, Kelvin Igwe from University of Johannesburg. We have Karin Badge from Northwest University. Karin is a clinical counseling psychologist. Then we have Dlamini Sipo, who is also a senior lecturer from University of Johannesburg. So all these are the research team that are actually providing support to the young scholar who would be speaking to us briefly after my introduction. And I hope we would definitely be enjoying the session as Gift take us through his research endeavor. And yes, I would just want to ask Gift to take over the floor and take us through to what he has been doing. So Gift, please, you are in charge now.
Okay. So thank you guys for coming to the presentation. As Prof mentioned, my name is Sontaga Forani, formerly known as Gift. And today's talk, I'll be speaking about synergizing emotional intelligence with African cultural contexts for AI-driven mental health support. So the outline of the presentation is as follows. I'll start by giving an introduction into the mental health crisis in South Africa. Then I'll be taking you guys through the background as to what AI has tried to do to support the problems that we have. And then I'll give an overview of, I'll be discussing basically the overview of the foundational theories that underpin my study. Then I'll be going into the proposed framework that I've been working on for the past year. And then I'll then be taking you guys through what the current status of implementation where I'm currently at with that. Cool. So South Africa is facing so I just want to put this. Cool. So South Africa is facing a mental health crisis. About 85% of South Africans do not have adequate access to mental health services. This lack of access, combined with depression and anxiety being the most prevalent issues, is made worse by the limited infrastructure and resources. So just to put this in perspective, 1 in 6 South Africans are likely to develop a common mental health disorder. According to a survey that was conducted in 2017, it was revealed that only about 11,000 registered psychologists were registered, not psychologists, mental health practitioners were registered with the HPCSA. In about 2017, the South African population was about 57 million. So if you to do the math, the patient to practitioner ratio in that case is 863 to 1, meaning that for every mental health practitioner, in order to accommodate everyone, every mental health practitioner would then have to support at least 863 people, right? To add on to these critical challenges, there's a low service uptake of these services. There's a high dropout rates in these interventions, and most common mental health disorders go untreated. There's also stigmas associated in Africa, associated with these mental health disorders, which is still a persistent barrier. So over the years, there's been a growing interest in leveraging AI-powered technologies to address the mental health disparities. AI technologies have been particularly effective in improving scalability and accessibility through chatbots. So traditional chatbots relied mainly on rule-based systems, which often led to superficial and robotic interactions, uh, often leading to superficial and shallow and robotic interactions, limiting the effectiveness of these interventions. So through recent advancements in large language models, there's been a shift towards more sophisticated solutions using LLMs. LLMs offer the potential to overcome these challenges by providing natural, engaging, and contextually relevant mental health support. So despite all the global advancements in AI, mental health applications, the adoption in Africa remains quite limited. And there's many reasons why this is the case, but research highlights three main things. Culturally relevance. Many AI mental health applications do not account for the unique challenges and nuances of African mental health, of the African mental health landscape, such as the role of community engagement or spirituality and just basic cultural nuances. Then secondly, Western-centric designs. Most mental health applications are designed with Western-centric frameworks that often fail to resonate with African cultural norms, values, and traditions. And another one, which is very important, is there's a lack of emotional intelligence in these models. What is emotional intelligence? Emotional intelligence denotes the capacity to adaptly interpret and manage emotion-fused emotion, subsequently harnessing it to steer cognitive tasks, ranging from problem solving to behavior regulation. What does this mean in the context of AI, right? It means that if you have a given context, a cultural context X, what is the most appropriate manner to respond? So addressing these limitations is critical for creating AI systems that are culturally relevant, emotional intelligence, and effective in addressing mental health disparities in Africa. So this is where my research comes in. My research explores synergizing emotional intelligence with African cultural context for AI and mental health. So to do this, there's some key theoretical foundations or studies that I've been looking at, namely cultural context, diversity, equity, and inclusion, cultural adaptation, cognitive behavioral therapy, and emotional intelligence. For the next session of the next part of the presentation, I'll be going through each of them, showing you how they important and how they come together. So what is cultural context, right? So cultural context refers to the set of values, beliefs, practices, traditions, social norms that define and influence the behaviors, relationships, and perspectives of a particular community or group. Why is it important in mental health? Cultural dynamics. So cultural dynamics play a critical role in shaping how communities understand, address mental health and address mental health. Different communities often view mental health through unique lenses. These lenses are often influenced by traditions, beliefs, and values. For example, in the African context, traditional beliefs, including spirituality and ancestral influences, significantly shape how mental, mental health challenges are interpreted and addressed. These cultural perspectives often determine whether individuals seek help, and if they do seek help, what kind of help are they open to trying? What types of interventions are they more open to, right? Secondly, linguistic nuances. So different cultures express emotions differently, right? Through the use of metaphors, assertions, somatic descriptions to communicate how they feel. In the context of AI, it's very important that the models are able to understand exactly where the user is coming from and understand the emotions that are embedded in the fabrics of emotions. Thirdly, social norms, right? Different social norms, different social contexts are they're very peculiar in how they deal with mental health. So you'd find that in some cultures, speaking openly about depression is not a thing, right? Even in the ways they deal with depression and anxiety is completely different. Some use faith-based approaches like maybe church counseling, some use prayer, some even use family interventions. By grounding mental health interventions in cultural context, practitioners and AI systems can create approaches that are not only accessible, but also deeply aligned with the lived experiences of African communities. Then diversity, equity, inclusion, right? So diversity, equity, and inclusion is a framework for understanding and addressing the complex issues of representation, fairness, participation in organizations, within organizations or systems. It gives us sort of what I call a platform or an opportunity to bridge the mental health service gap, particularly for marginalized groups. And it looks at three main dimensions. It looks at diversity, which says that apps should cater to varying needs of considering cultural, linguistic, and socio-economic factors. Equity says that apps should ensure that they provide fair, effective support addressing disparities in access and outcomes. Inclusion, on the other hand, which is what I'm focusing on in my research, is that apps should create a welcoming environment, taking into account the diverse perspectives and ultimately promoting inclusivity. This is very critical in app development because it forms the foundation and the backbone of engagement, right? So I did mention cultural adaptation. So before we get to cultural adaptation, I want to explain what the difference is between culturally grounded interventions and culturally adapted interventions. Culturally adapted interventions are rooted in understanding and acknowledging the cultural background and beliefs of individuals receiving the mental health service. It is tailored to specific cultural, social, and psychological needs of a certain community, and it often involves collaboration with key stakeholders such as community leaders to ensure relevance and effectiveness. Then culturally adapted interventions, by definition, is the systematic modification of evidence-based treatments to consider language, cultural context in such a way that it is compatible with the client's cultural patterns. It comes in two groups, right? It can be done in two levels. First, there's the surface level structure changes and the deep level structure changes. Surface level structure changes entails the basic modification to an intervention so that it fits into a particular context. This can be done by maybe if there's a narrative like a story, translating the story into a different language, changing the characters. Maybe there's Mona Lisa within a story, you might use someone that the community is more familiar with, like, I don't know, Brenda Fassie, for lack of a better example. Then deep structure changes, on the other hand, modifies the fundamental components and underlying principles of an intervention so that to enhance its impact and relevance within that particular cultural context. It is important to know that cultural adaptation is not a one-size-fits-all. As a matter of fact, it can be argued that in many cases, culturally grounded interventions could benefit from cultural groundedness and vice versa. So just to give a background, usually you'd find that there's a culture, let's say there's a psychological intervention being developed maybe in America or some Western community, right? This intervention would go through, or therapy would then go through its clinical trials, approval, and everything. And then once they've seen that it works and it's effective, this intervention or psychological therapy would then get exported to other countries where it's being used, where it can be used. But before it can be used in that particular context, it has to go through cultural adaptation. And this cultural adaptation doesn't happen in an arbitrary fashion. It is usually guided by established frameworks, all of which try to achieve distinct things. One of the most popular ones is called the EVM, the ecological validity model. And the ecological validity model is as I've mentioned, it's a framework for guiding cultural adaptation of psychological interventions. And it says, in order to culturally adapt an intervention, there's 8 key components that we need to look at, or 8 key dimensions. The language of the intervention, the people or the persons that are involved, the metaphors that are being used, the content, the concepts that are used in the intervention, the goal of the intervention, the methods of administering the intervention, and the context itself in which you can, and the context in which you're administering the intervention. Examples of this implementation includes a step-by-step for Chinese young adults, Project Yes for San Diego youth. Research shows that culturally adapted interventions are way more effective than non-adapted ones. So back to emotional intelligence, right? So we've defined emotional intelligence, but why is it important in mental health? Well, there's two groups, right? Why is it important for mental health, and then why is it important from an AI perspective, right? From a from a mental health perspective, right? Uh, Cultural nuances in expression are different from culture to culture. Emotional expressions in African context often incorporates communication, storytelling, metaphors, proverbs. All of these are significantly different from Western norms, where emotions may be expressed directly. Africans are more prone, in some cases, to use somatic descriptions to explain to basically express how they feel. Then there's the role of language. Many Africans speak indigenous languages that convey emotions and stresses differently. And AI systems should be able to account for these linguistic variations to interpret and respond meaningfully. I think this is not just for AI, but also in the psychological domain. And then number three, unique stressors. African individuals face distinct stresses, which are mainly rooted in socio-economic challenges, communal responsibility, historical inequality, and I think something that's very close to most of us is spirituality, whether it be ancestral or Christian spirituality. Then why is it important? Why is EI or emotional intelligence critical from an AI perspective? Well, it's important for AI systems to understand where the users come from, understanding the cultural context in which they come from, right? AI models should be able to comprehend the underlying meaning behind specific ways of expressing distress, as I've mentioned, such as the use of physical or somatic expressions. Then building trust. By aligning responses with local cultural norms, AI systems can create a sense of safety and trust, encouraging individuals to engage more openly in mental health support. And lastly, fostering connection. Emotional intelligence systems should be able to validate users' experiences, show empathy and understanding, which are critical in mental health interventions, especially in the context of Africa. So, cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So cognitive behavioral therapy is a form of psychotherapy that helps individuals identify and change negative thought patterns and behaviors to improve emotional well-being. It is widely recognized as the gold standard for treating depression and anxiety. Its key features includes the fact that it's an evidence-based treatment, and it focuses on present issues and solutions, and it's also structured and goal oriented, which is why it's such a good candidate for AI, mainly because if you read through literature, especially in the AI context, most researchers try to plug themselves into certain steps of CBT, right? They either improve certain steps, whether it's the assessment part of it, whether it's the relapse prevention. Because it's such a structured therapeutic approach, it's easy to slot yourself into specific steps. So CBT has different steps, right? There's the assessment, there's the goal setting, there's identifying negative thoughts, challenging them, behavioral intervention, skill building, and even relapse prevention. The ones that I want to bring your attention to, which is number 1, 2, 3, and 4, in that you have a case study, right? Given that you have a case study or that you have a portfolio, right, of a patient, is the model able to detect the symptoms of depression and anxiety from that case study, assuming that the case study is an authentic case study in such a way that it is representative of how an African person would express these symptoms. Because before we even start looking at the counseling aspect of everything, we need to be able to see, is the model able to firstly detect the symptoms before providing any counseling or um, something along those lines. So the number 2 and 3 sort of go together under a technique called cognitive restructuring. And number 4 is behavioral intervention, which focuses on changing unhelpful behaviors through specific techniques like behavioral activation, as I've mentioned, or exposure therapy. So these are the core fundamental techniques of CBT, right? There's cognitive restructuring that I've mentioned, which identifies and challenges negative thought patterns. There's behavioral activation, there's problem solving, and then there's exposure therapy. So from a developer perspective, what researchers do or what computer scientists do is that they study these techniques, right? The principles that underlie these techniques. And then from there on, we sort of try to package it in a software solution. I'll give an example. So with cognitive restructuring, you might have a module for journaling, right? Where users journal and then, or maybe answer certain questions, ultimately helping them to be more aware of their thoughts, or in psychology, they call it automatic thoughts, right? And then from there on, you can have a sub-module or an AI agent that goes through the journal and then provides support using that knowledge that it has. Or for example, behavioral activation, I think it's used a lot, especially in marketing or in just different apps that do not have to do with mental health. If you have I think a lot of people have the Bible app. I think it's a very good example. The Bible app, if you read the Bible constantly for the whole week, it gives you perfect strikes, right? That is a form of behavioral activation because there's a reward mechanism associated with that particular behavior. And the reason why there's a reward mechanism is that it tries to promote that particular behavior. And that's just another example of how, of using the principles of behavioral activation in applications. And it's also done the same in mental health applications. So then you get problem solving, which could include, I don't know, sort of like a retrospective challenge where the users now have to essentially, how do I put it, where they have to solve a problem in order to achieve something, right? And it ultimately helps develop effective coping strategies of managing stress and interpersonal conflicts. So what are the limitations of using CBT as raw as it comes? So over previous years, there's been quite a lot of talks, and it turns out that CBT has its roots in Western origins. And that's it's a bit of a problem, especially in African contexts. And that goes because of the underpinning the psychology, right? There's a difference between African and Western psychology. I'm going to get to that in the next points, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. Secondly, there's a cultural mismatch. So research shows that many African cultures prioritize communal well-being and collective problem solving over individual introspection, right? Thirdly and fourthly is the limited relevance of core techniques, accessibility and applicability. Studies indicate that Western therapies like CBT, right, often focus on individual thought process, which may not align with the communal and relational focus of African societies. For example, interventions that involve families and communities are often more effective in African contexts. So just a summary of the research gaps that I've found that I'm trying to bridge, right? Firstly is the Western-centric approach. So I did mention this in the previous slide. So CBT finds its roots in Western psychology. And Western psychology, according to literature, is quite individualistic in nature, whereas with African psychology, it's quite communal. These two are completely contradictory to each other. And as such, you need to somewhat account for these things. Then number two, there's a lack of cultural adaptation in South Africa, especially from a research perspective. To the best of my knowledge, I stand to be corrected. I don't think there's any other research in South Africa that focuses on the cultural adaptation of psychological interventions. I think the closest we've come is the adaptation of education, cultural adaptation of education, but I haven't seen many studies that have to do with cultural adaptation of psychological interventions. Thirdly, as great as LLMs and AI models are, and as promising as they are, unfortunately, most of these models are trained on Western data. I just forgot to include here that show that most large language models are trained on internet data, and when internet data is more skewed towards Western perspectives. So merely just fine-tuning a model is not really, or just using a model as it comes, is not really a sufficient solution to address the scalability and the disparities that are currently in existence. So This is the framework that I've been working on. So I did mention that I'm working on DEI with a focus on inclusion, achieving it through cultural adaptation. So as I've mentioned, this cultural adaptation comes in two levels. There's deep level structure changes and then there's surface level structure changes. So what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to synergize Ubuntu, which is a very beautiful philosophy. A lot of people look at it from a very surface level, right? A very surface level of I am because you are, and all the cliched sayings. But it's actually a very interesting philosophy, and it's also cultural context. And you'll see why I say that. But what I'm trying to do ultimately is that I'm trying to synergize cognitive behavioral therapy with Ubuntu. And what I'm focusing on is the on culturally appropriate behavioral activation and culturally appropriate Socratic questioning for cognitive restructuring. Then for the surface level structure changes, I've devised or not devised, I've curated a framework for um, what I call the adaptation of communication, which is a set of principles that should govern or that should guide the development of LLM interaction between the LLM interaction between a user and the agent. So in 2013, there's a very beautiful article that I came across by Wilson and Williams. And these two authors were trying to conceptualize Ubuntu uh, or a framework for Ubuntu for positive well-being. And they came and they devised a set of themes for Ubuntu, right? Then they identify three themes. There's competency, there's consciousness, and then there's connectedness. Competency refers to the skills and abilities for effective functioning. It emphasizes personal development and contributions to the community. Consciousness, on the other hand, is the awareness of one's identity and values with a focus on collective responsibility and cultural heritage. Connectedness is the sense of belonging and interdependence within a community, highlighting empathy and mutual support. So what I've done is I've dived a bit into literature and specifically Ubuntu, and I've extracted what I call tenets, which are foundation blocks that make up these themes. And this is what I've come up with. So for consciousness, you have self-awareness, mindfulness, understanding one's place within the social broader context. For competency, you have things like recognition of individual uniqueness, future aspirations, personal development, responsibility. For connectedness, there's social well-being and relationships. But one thing I would like to bring your attention to is the connection with divinity. Most psychological frameworks that are there usually either suppress this or they don't have it at all. And this is quite concerning because in African psychology, spirituality cannot be overlooked. It's a very fundamental component, which is why I was saying that Ubuntu is such a beautiful context because it encompasses a lot. You could call it as an umbrella, an overarching cultural context, as opposed to looking at specific cultural contexts of Zulus or Tsonga people. It basically encompasses a lot of things that are either focused on individually in separate frameworks or suppressed altogether. So I did mention that I'm focusing on behavioral activation inspired by Ubuntu. So remember I said that CBT finds its roots in Western contexts, right? So behavioral activation from an Western perspective and an African perspective looks quite different. In a Western context, it might say that take a walk, journal, meditation, self-care activities. From an African perspective or Africa-centric perspective, it might entail something like prayer or speaking to elders or reading scripture or doing things that involve community engagement. And that's what I'm trying to capture in the emotional intelligence framework to say that when you're having a conversation with an LLM, its ability to inherently or naturally steer the behavioral activation step towards these particular um, Africa-centric behavioral activation, right, would be a very key indication that the LLM or the AI agent is emotionally intelligent. Then there's Socratic questioning, the adaptation of cognitive restructuring using Socratic questioning. Socratic questioning is a technique used to challenge and reframe negative thoughts by asking guided, open-ended questions that encourage critical thinking. So cognitive Socratic questioning from a Western perspective or a normal way might be like, how does this thought affect your personal happiness? But however, in an African perspective, it might be like, how does this thought affect your connection to your family or community? Then another example would be what would happen if you thought differently about the situation, right? But within an African perspective, which focuses on community and family and empathy and mutual support, it might be like, how might this thought change if you viewed it from a perspective of your family's well-being? And that's what I'm trying to embed into the emotional intelligence fabric of AI agents that provide mental health support. Then I did mention that there is, for the surface level strategy, I have a table called the adaptation of communication. This table is derived from the ecological validity model, Spinel's taxonomy of adaptation of internet and mobile-based interventions for mental disorders, and Vernon's article for culturally competent social robots in Africa. And so these are sort of like the principles that should guide. I just want to do this. So these are the set of principles that should guide the design of the model and also the interaction between the model and the user. For example, using a familiar name for the LLM ensures that there's comfort and then there's trust amongst between the agent and the user. The use of culturally appropriate metaphors, idioms, and proverbs. The use of titles. So in most African cultures, we don't have titles such as Miss, Mrs., Mr. We have different titles, and in some contexts, hierarchy, these titles are aligned with hierarchy, right? And another one which is interesting, which is the integration of spiritual elements. I got a question a while back about how exactly I plan on implementing this, because South Africa, there's a lot of what is it? Spirituality, right? There's ancestral spirituality, there's Christian spirituality, and the likes. So how exactly am I planning on doing this? So according to the most recent census that was conducted in South Africa, about 80% of South Africans see themselves or proclaim to be Christian. So given this rationale that over 80% of them see themselves as Christian, you can easily then go with the faith-based approach of Christian support. So this could entail biblical comfort or grounding the faith-based approach in Christian routines. And this is a very convenient thing because the Christian religion or Christian or faith-based support is quite well documented. Then there's the use of simple language to ensure that uh, everyone that is using the LLM sort of understands the interaction. A lot of South Africans don't speak English as their first language. So using very fancy English would to some degree undermine the intervention. Then the goal of the intercommunication that every interaction between the LLM should emulate sort of a therapy session in that it should have a goal at the end of the day. Then the use of somatic symptom descriptions, which I've found quite interesting. So it turns out that most Africans don't like using clinical terms because of the stigma that are associated. However, if you use somatic descriptions, they are more open to it because although from a clinical perspective, being tired severely tired is a core cause for concern. In in our culture or in African cultures, it's usually seen as a noble thing if someone is tired because that's associated with you working hard, contributing to your community. And it also it removes the stigma associated with using these clinical terms. So to the implementation, right? There's two parts to the implementation that I'm trying to get past. So first of all, just as a disclaimer, I don't have any participants in my study, mainly because of ethical considerations and everything. So what I'm doing is I'm working with Ms. Karen, who's the senior counsel at the Northwest University, to sort of design or come up with test cases. Test cases being case scenarios that have symptoms of depression and anxiety embedded in its fabric. So basically, how would a Black person or an African person express symptoms of depression and anxiety? Um, and once you have such a case study, then you can then test, is the model able to detect these symptoms of depression and anxiety, right? And then from there on, you can also engage the model from that use case study to see, is the model in essence emotionally intelligent, as in does it appropriately or in the right manner embody the framework that we've been working on. So I've been working with Ms. Karen on that. And then for the model data sets, I'll be working with Dr. Sipho Dlamini from UJ, who's a specialist in Africa-centered psychology. And I'll be using him to give me guidance on the cultural of basically testing the cultural authenticity of the model outputs. So is the model behaving in a culturally appropriate manner? Is it responding in a way that a psychologist would mostly respond, so to put it? So if Ms. Karen is on the call, this is an old slide that I'm using right now. I'm still working on the revised, the revised case studies. But this is just something that I've been doing. This is the initial approach that I went with. So there's a thing called the DAS-21, which stands for the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale, which is a self-questionnaire that patients can use to basically um, basically see how severe the symptoms of depression and anxiety are. And also it's used by psychologists to determine how effective the treatment that the patient is currently going through, right? So what I did is, given that we have those questionnaires, right, and assuming that those questionnaires are all symptoms, what I'm doing is I adapted those questions and then I derived case studies that somewhat embed those symptoms into that case study. For example, there's a case study that I have of someone feeling uneasy about their role as a youth leader, right? And the symptoms that are there is that I feel very anxious about my role in my community or group setting. I found it very hard to come down after an interaction with my after interaction strained my social bonds, right? If you have such a case study, then and the model is able to detect these symptoms, then the next step is somewhat not easier, but it's made simpler because now since you already have sorry, since you already have these statements, I mean, since you already have these symptoms, you can now then go forward and then start the counseling process. So the first iteration of implementing the framework was using prompt engineering as a sole technique. So prompt engineering refers to the design of instructions prompts aimed at enhancing the performance of existing language models without the use or the need for model retraining. Examples of it are zero shot, where you don't give the model an example, you just tell it to do this, right? Then there's few shot, where you give it examples of how exactly to do something, and then it will try to follow that same sequence of steps, right? Or that same output. Then there's another one, which is a more popular one called chain of thought. And chain of thought, you basically step for step tell the model what to do and how to do it. Then using this first approach of prompt engineering as a sole technique, there was quite a number of problems, which also goes back to what I said, that although LLMs are quite good and they are very good at in conversations, unfortunately, because they're trained on Western data, they can't be used in the same manner. They can't be used in their raw state. So the challenges that I faced with using prompt engineering as a sole technique was the loss of natural conversation. So the LLM wasn't able to have a natural conversation, right? It sounded too robotic. It didn't sound like you were having an interaction with a person. Also, there was also an exaggeration of certain communication rules. So you'd find that you tell it that, okay, use African proverbs or use metaphors when you're in your communication or integrate it sparingly. You'd find that if maybe you have 5 steps, the model would overly emphasize 3 of them. For example, it would overly use metaphors in every single response. And then another interesting thing that I found is that there's quite a big distortion of African context. When the model was instructed to embody a personality or to use or follow a set of sequence steps, right? It ended up speaking speaking about baboons or making um, showing exactly that it doesn't really understand the African context, further buttressing on the part that that large language models inherently do not have, inherently are trained on Western data. So to address these issues, this is the current framework that I have. So we started first with conceptualizing depression and anxiety, right? So we identified that, no, not conceptualizing depression and anxiety. We started with conceptualizing Ubuntu. We identified that Ubuntu had 3 themes, and then we extracted the tenets. From those tenets, I was able to curate a data set that aligns with these tenets, right? And then there was the introduction of African proverbs, idioms, and then there was also the introduction of culturally appropriate behavioral activation into the data set. All these components of the data set are ultimately to address the problems that I faced in the previous iteration of using prompt engineering. So for example, if you were to go to an AI model right now, like a famous AI model, can be the ChatGPTs, right? And you were to ask it to give you 5 African proverbs or maybe 10. The first 3 or 4 might be correct, but at some point it starts hallucinating and defaulting back to Western proverbs. So what I tried doing is that I tried introducing the actual proverbs, African proverbs, into the model. And then with culturally appropriate behavioral activation, um, I tried introducing that mainly because it's hard to basically capture behavioral activation within a, a prompt, right? You can give a couple of examples, but over time, you can't account for everything. So it was important to introduce the culturally appropriate behavioral activation. From this, I was able to fine tune a conversational agent. And as you can see here, so my back end is built in Python Flask. This Python Flask application interacts with the LLM, and then sends the response back to the front end, which is built in Angular, right? The Angular framework is basically where the results are rendered. The front end takes in the user message, or in this case, the case study, sends it back to the back end. The back end then sends it back to the LLM to generate a response and then renders it back. For system prompting, I use chain of thought and persona priming. This is so that the model can then take a personality, and then I can also um, embed some of the principles from the adaptation of communication, such as the use of somatic descriptions, to further enhance the model so that it sticks to that particular set of rules. Right. So for the detection of depression and anxiety, I also have a sub data set in which I personally curated a data set where I fine-tuned a model that was able to detect depression and anxiety symptoms and then render it to the Python Flask and then send it back to the front end. So these are just some pilot studies. So the LLM is named Karabo. It's named after my sister. And essentially, I wasn't really sure how to show this, but these are just some samples. So the LLM, if you have a conversation with it long enough, you'll see that it tries to support you using that Ubuntu framework that I talked about. So if it sees that you are struggling with competency or a consciousness problem, it will beautifully just steer the conversation in that direction using those set of tenets to basically address the problem. And then on the right hand side, this is the detect symptoms module. where since you have a case study, right, what are the set of symptoms that this case study has? If you look at the bottom there, if we have some psychologists here, you'll see that these are not really uh, verbatim symptoms. These are the adapted symptoms that I basically derived from the DAS 21. And yeah, thank you guys. And I think I'll take questions now if there are any questions.
Thank you, Gift, for this excellent presentation. I mean, this is whole packed and well articulated as well. I would just try to open the space for people to, I mean, throw in their questions if there is any. Not sure, please. You, yes, Zipporah,
Yes,
please
I
go.
don't see a hand from my side, so I didn't know how to raise my hand.
No, it's fine. You can ask. We're all ears.
Yes, thank you so much. And Tobela Sontaga, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I just have a few questions because, and my first concern is the umbrella word of African, because Africa and Africanism is very vast and big, and how we react to certain circumstances also it depends on context and gender as well. And I haven't heard you talk about gender at all. And within the African context, there is gendering of mental health. That we expect women to be crazy in certain contexts. So they will say to you, yes, we expected this behavior because you are a woman, and it's still happening in our context, in this day and age. And another question is based on the fact that you have already realized that the LLMs are not compatible with the proverbs, of some of the African proverbs. And most of the time, if I could give you an example with because I'm a cluster coordinator in the student housing, and we deal a lot with mental health amongst students. So one of them is from Mpumalanga. She came to me and she said, Ms. Ramela, I am anxious because I'm going to be a Tlatswadirope. I'm not sure if you know what Tlatswadirope is. You see, that's my issue with the umbrella word for now saying we have an African model for mental health through AI. So I will break it down for you what Tlatswadirope is. Maybe we'll start considering my concern. When my sister passes away, then I go and replace her in her house. So I'm going to wash her husband's thighs. That's what the proverb means, to be a Tlatswadirope. So I'm going to replace my sister, whether I like it or not. I must go and be my sister's husband's new wife and take over from where my sister left off. Now you can understand the stress. Now, if I'm going to have an AI that is to read proverbs, don't you think we should start with I don't know if it exists, the short language models, so that we capture this AI language from small to big? Because already now with the LLM, it looks like from large to small, it is not helping us in our context. Can't we start from short language model to a large language model? And also, my worry is that you don't have participants. And are we not going to face a situation where we are going to be told, oh, now Africans can be replaced by models? So you don't even want to know how we feel. you see. So, and my other issue is for you to now adapt this African, what do you call it? African cultural context with the CBT. Why don't you give it a different name, an African name, other than adapt it with CBT, so that it becomes a unique thing for Africans? Yes, let me stop there. Thank you.
Zipporah, thank you very much. Gift, I'll soon hand over to you. It just to also be very clear that this is a pilot study, and there is this notion that at least, yes, we have we're looking at a very diverse context when it comes to Africa. Our cultures might differ. The way we see things, the way what we believe in might differ, but at least we will have a convergence. And if you look deep, I mean, most of these cultural instances across Africa have a common relationship, depending on how we might interpret it. Yes, but we just want to sit the ball rolling to say, yes, we really understand the limitation of this artificial intelligence technology that we're using. They are very significant, and also they are very, very important to us. We can't shy away from the truth that there are inherent benefit that comes with the use of this technology, which are being often at times imposed on us to just consume without actually making any input. But we just have to start from somewhere, and this is exactly what we're doing now. You've raised several important pointers to what we should be considering in terms of building or enhancing these technologies that we do encounter on a daily basis. And I can assure you that we're just trying our best to see how we can touch various aspects that relate to African culture and their tradition. It's not something that we can just address on the go and say, okay, we are here to solve all the problem, but we must start from somewhere. And this is exactly what Gift is doing now. If we're chewing it bit by bit until we at least have arrived at our final destination. Gift, you might want to, I think Zipporah did raise a lot, provided certain suggestion and comment, which also might be relevant in the way you look at the way you would extend your study. Gift, you might want to just provide maybe a generic response to her comment.
Oh, okay. I think you answered most of the questions, but just to go back to the question about starting with a short language model, right, with respect to uh, capturing proverbs, right, specific cultural proverbs. There are technologies that you could use for that, like for example, RAG, which is basically a database where that could log all these specific idioms and proverbs. And then essentially the LLM could then use these proverbs to inform its responses. But then as Prof mentioned, currently it's a pilot study, right? And we're just trying to get the ball rolling to say that, okay, can we at least, that's why we're not focusing on specific cultures like Zulu culture or Tsonga culture or whatever culture. We're focusing more on the overarching cultural context. And I think Ubuntu is a very good starting point because although Ubuntu is a South African philosophy, it coincides a lot with most of the African contexts. So I think just to answer your question, there are ways that you can go about integrating specific idioms and proverbs. You don't have to go to a short model because the nice thing about large language models is that they're quite good at communication, right? Starting at a small scale might, or maybe just, yeah, it might hinder the performance of the model. And that's what we're trying to work. What we're trying to work on more is more emotional intelligence. And that is trying to steer the model into the right direction rather than getting it perfect. As Prof mentioned, it is a pilot study at this point.
Thanks, Gift.
If we could, if
Zipporah,
yeah.
Zipporah, if you have any other comment, please, you can just email it to us, and we'll definitely put that into consideration in the way we build the model. I'm not sure, given Good afternoon. How are you? I see that your video is on. Are you do you have any question for us? All right, okay. That's good. Yes, I see a hand. Gray. Gray, good afternoon. Yes, you can go. Go for it.
Yes, hi. So I think this is a very, very exciting and cool project. And I totally get why you are arguing that we need to move away from CBT towards a more African approach. I do wonder, though, with your training data, do you have kind of clinical psychological literature? Because it seemed that your training, your kind of fine-tuning training data was mostly Ubuntu focused stuff. And while I understand why that's in the data set, I also wonder if you should be also including some psychological literature. So, for example, a similar kind of chatbot exists in, I think it's Italy or Spain, and there they used, a few 100,000 hours of psychological conversation. So conversations between professional therapists and the people. And I wonder if you can find African versions of that type of data. So where you still have a professional, so you get that kind of psychological and clinical knowledge, and that's not lost, but is rather enhanced by the kind of Ubuntu African perspective.
Thanks, Gray. I think that's a very interesting question. Gift, do you have anything to?
Yes, I actually have an answer for the question.
All right, okay.
So according to the research that I've done, there's not really a lot of data sets that are there that are currently rooted in African context. I've tried looking around. Most of the data sets that are there are usually either Western or they are in a different language, but then they're usually not African mental health data sets, which is why I'm basically using cultural adaptation as an intermediate solution. So I also remember that Zipporah asked, why don't we name it a different thing? Well, if we name it a different thing, that would be crossing the boundary from cultural adaptation to culturally grounded interventions now. So I just remember that question when Gray was speaking. So also with regards to data sets, so the data sets that I initially worked on, I self-created myself using some psychological, literature. But then there are existing mental health data sets that have been vetted by professional psychologists. And currently what I'm trying to do is I have a data set which is about 400,000 lines, right? And what I'm doing at this point of my implementation, I just forgot to mention it, is that I am trying to inject cultural context into this data set. And by cultural context, what I'm trying to say is that the Ubuntu philosophy that I've come across or that I've come up with, right? What I'm trying to do is I am trying to adapt the language and the dialogue instance, so to call it, in such a way that it aligns with the framework that I've come up with. So yes, I am currently working on a data set. It's not a native data set. It's more of an intermediate solution. While there's other people, hopefully, that get on board and work on data sets that are actually rooted in African context. So the intermediate solution at this point would be to adapt data sets that are currently in existence, that have been vetted by psychologists, and then adapt these data sets. And by adapting, for example, I did mention behavioral activation. In cases where there are maybe there's a suggestion to maybe journal or to do this, a form of adaptation would then be to maybe adapt the dialogue instance so that it aligns with the Africa-centric behavioral activation, or finding candidates for where spirituality can be, or faith-based approaches can be used. So I am working on that, just to answer your question.
All right. Thanks, Gift. I hope Gray is satisfied with that, and I also would welcome. We would welcome any further suggestion. I'm just looking out for a hand, and I don't think there is any hand at this very moment. Yeah. I think Gift, you've done quite well with the detailed explanation that you've actually provided with what you're currently working on. I also want to just acknowledge and appreciate the presence of one of your supervisor, Karin. Karin, thanks for joining us on this discussion. So if there is no any further question, I think I just want to wish everyone and to say that we really appreciate your time and presence in this discussion. And yeah, we would like to bring the discussion to a close. Please just feel free to send us an email, drop us an email if you have any further suggestion or any question that you would want to send to us, and those things will be welcomed. So yeah, I wish everyone a good day, further good day ahead, and yeah, stay safe. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you,
Please
Prof.
bye for me. Bye.
Thank you.